What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. We got Jays Jumpers, Jaron Jackson Jr.'s, John Morant's, Joe Johnson's, Jaw Refs, of course. Wait, I keep messing up. There are no John Morant's or Jaw Refs. There are Jaw Refs. That's what we decided.
Yeah.
We decided there are Jaw Refs. John Morant on temporary hiatus from the intro to the podcast. I suppose Jimmy Butlers are still there. The Miami
Absolutely.
Heat, still kicking.
Jamal Murray's?
Sure. Nikola Jokic's. It has less of a ring because it's not a J sound. It's a
Yeah. Right. Michael Porter Jr.
Sure. Just all of them. Just throw them all in there. But we got Jays. We got him for days. Josh, how you doing?
I don't know. Did you feel like the Zach Edey thing was kind of anticlimactic?
I not for a single second thought he was staying in the draft. Not for a single second.
Yeah.
So,
and I guess
so
I was
guess,
hoping.
Yeah.
I was hoping we were going to get some kind of Canadian, big maple reference or something. I don't know. I was hoping for kind of.
That's Fardaz AMAC. That's the big maple. Hold on a second.
Doesn't Zach Edey go by that too?
He might. I just know that Fardaz was the one that I was researching and learned that he was also the big maple.
I just felt like there was a big opportunity here, and he just kind of went with the Wolf of Wall Street thing. But
yeah, I guess I don't exactly see Zach Edey as an overproduced return to Purdue thing, and I also don't see Purdue as the type of program who would overproduce some sort of return thing.
Right, that's the other part of it, is that Zach Edey and that program are not the people to produce that kind of content. Right. You're absolutely correct.
Right. So, I don't know. I thought... I didn't for a second think he was gonna not come back. So I guess from that perspective, I would have been like, "Did you think that everybody thought you were gonna stay in the draft?" kind of thing. That we put together this big massive video, but it is what it is. He's back, the big fella, on his way back to Purdue. And with nothing but a tasteful social media video grab from another movie.
Yeah.
May 31st was the NBA draft declaration deadline. Sure.
National holiday.
National holiday. List of guys heading into yesterday, there was a substantial list of guys that were going to impact the college basketball season, whether they were actually playing college basketball or not. And we were waiting for a host of them to make decisions. Yesterday had some stay in the draft, had some come back to college. And Josh, I was thinking about this throughout the day, that for all of the maybe overreaction, maybe just conversation about what all of the alternative paths to the NBA draft and to the NBA there are that exist now. Yesterday, there were a lot of guys that are fun for college basketball that stayed in college basketball, and it felt like a day that set up what's going to be a fun college basketball season next year. And we get to, we have all these conversations about, you can go to the G League night, you could go to Overtime Elite, you could go overseas, you could do this or that. And when we get to these days in the calendar where those things kind of meet, right? That it doesn't feel like college basketball is struggling to keep its big names longer. If anything, guys are staying longer now because of the financial gains that they could have, and for a lot of them, gains that go beyond what they would make playing for a G League team or playing on a two-way contract in the NBA next season. So I thought it was a good day for college basketball, and there are a lot of fun names, and as a result, teams that are going to be fun next season in college hoops.
Yeah, I feel like, and maybe you agree, usually there are a few guys that stay in the draft that you just kind of go, not sure about that one.
Mm-hmm.
I get it, right? I'm never going to fault somebody for beginning a professional career and trying to make money.
Mm-hmm.
But just from a development career perspective, should probably flip those around, career development perspective, I'm just not sure that's the best option. Right? And I feel like this season, and to a certain extent last season as well, that has started to change with NIL, where there isn't that pressure to begin because the financial, like you just said, the financial impact is not all that appealing because you have the ability to make so much money in college. And so now it's more of a, is this really in my best interest to go now? Or do I feel like being in college another season is going to give me an opportunity to develop something further? Or I have kind of a specific Zach Edey thing I want to say for once we start talking about him in particular. But I felt like there weren't many people I was surprised by their decision.
Certainly not the ones that I was all that curious in their decisions. Like, Josiah Jordan James withdrew from the NBA draft. There were some Tennessee volunteer decisions that were interesting, but honestly, I just don't especially care all that much. And I think you're right. There used to be the guys that were gonna go to the draft on potential anyways, regardless of when they went. It seemed like if there was any chance they would be picked, late in the first round or early in the second round, that they were all going.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't seem to be the case anymore, because it was either play college hoops and okay, maybe your draft stock goes up, but also it could just be another 30 game sample size that maybe your potential shouldn't be sought after.
Right.
And
And more question marks about whether you can really reach what you're supposed to be.
correct,
Right. And
correct.
instead,
And
Dylan Mitchell is coming back to Texas.
right, exactly. And NIL is absolutely absolutely a part of that equation.
Yeah. And so the only example I can think of is Chris Livingston, who is still probably going to be a first rounder.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like he's out there betting on himself to go through a G League contract to get to the NBA.
Right.
And he's going to get drafted because he was on he was on NBA radars. He was highly touted recruit, all of that stuff. And he's about the only one where, from a kind of evaluation perspective, you're betting a lot on potential. And he had some good moments last season where Dylan Mitchell, just because that team was so good, didn't get very many opportunities. You could see the talent, you could see the athleticism. But now he's, because of NIL and because of his decision to stay, right? He could have a monster season with a much bigger role for Texas. And all of a sudden you're talking about, oh, if this goes well, you're talking about a lottery pick next season and a guy you feel really good about because he's got all the stuff that you can't really teach in terms of the skills. And now he can prove that he can put it together in the Big 12.
Right. So let's get into this. Let's start with Zach Edey, and then we can kind of go from there. Of course, reigning National Player of the Year, 22.3 points, 12.9 rebounds, 2.1 blocks per game. Is that any good? On his way back to West Lafayette. And, like I said a moment ago, I never really thought that Edey was going to stay in the draft. Just like I didn't think, and I kind of roped the two big fellows together, just like I didn't really think Oscar Tshiebwe was going to return to Kentucky and return to college. But nonetheless, a really big deal for a Purdue program that's been pretty quiet this offseason otherwise, and that's pretty typical of a Matt Painter program. There's not a ton of bring guys in, guys are leaving type of musical chairs, so to speak. You're right. They're bringing a small forward in from the Indianapolis area, a freshman in Miles Colvin, Lance Jones from Southern Illinois, a guy who's a defensive all MVC defense type guard, roughly 14 points a game the last 3 years. But other than that, there's not a ton going on. So Edey coming back, right, is the foundation, is the pillar at the center of anything that Matt Painter's team might do next season. And whatever their ceiling is in 2023-24, unlocked by the fact that the big guy from Canada is going to be lurking around West Lafayette for one more year.
Yeah. It's an interesting question to think about how good they would have been without him. I mean, they're probably an NCAA tournament team, right? You'd have to give them the benefit of the doubt there.
Yeah, but probably only because it's Matt Painter on the sidelines.
And you got a year of continuity, and yeah.
Sure, but we got to the point by the end of the year that no one liked anything that Purdue did other than the fact that Zach Edey was on the team.
Right.
It would have been a trendy, like Purdue is bottom 5 in the Big Ten. It would have been a trendy thing to say heading into next season.
Yeah. Far and away the most important decision that came. Mm-hmm. The thing I kept thinking about and kind of my, I guess, quote unquote, take on this is if you're Edey, right? There was this talk about, somebody offering, basically guaranteeing to draft him in the second round and all that kind of stuff. Outside of the obvious that when you play high-level sports, you can get injured. And as a 7'4" guy, your body's probably a little more susceptible to that. What is the downside here? Outside of the obvious, right, you can make all this money, you get to be the best player in the country, compete for a national championship, and have a responsibility you're not going to have again in your career, probably. At least in the NBA. Just from an NBA draft stock standpoint, somebody's still going to take him in the second round next year. How can you not? Mm-hmm. And if he starts shooting threes, maybe he turns into Walker Kessler, Now, not the same player, but this idea of that guy doesn't really look like he fits, but all of a sudden he finds a way to fit and makes contributions, and he helps himself be able to stay on the floor because all of a sudden this guy who's so good in the post, you also have to respect because he's got a jump shot and he can give you 16, to 22 valuable minutes a game. They're just, his floor is so high because he is Zach Edey. That it's not like there aren't any questions about what he provides. It's the opposite of Dylan Mitchell, right? Those high ceiling guys, the more you play and you don't actually live up to your potential, the more questions that they're going to be, like we were talking about, of can you actually reach that? Edey, it's the opposite. It's does he have anything else? Well, maybe he does, and if he does, he's going to get to show it. And if he doesn't, it's still a 7'4" guy who's a great passer and is just a behemoth. He's still going to be able to help your team, even if he doesn't show any kind of improvement over the next year.
Yeah, I and someone asked me a similar question a couple of days ago, and they said, "Do you think he's going to stay?" And I said, "Yes, I think he's going to stay, and I think he's going to take 2.5 threes a game."
Yeah,
because that's, to your point, there's a very obvious, like, he's going to average 22 and 13 again next year. He's just going to. If anything, the big guys he has to face in the Big Ten got easier. Right. Because there's no Hunter Dickinson and there's no Trace Jackson Davis. And Coleman Hawkins isn't exactly the type of guy to lock down Zach Edey. There's just nobody. Like, he's going to average a ludicrous amount of points. Purdue's going to be in the conversation, and he's going to run away with Big Ten Player of the Year. There's nobody else that's in the conversation for me. And as a result, to your point, like, I think I just find it hard to believe that even if he doesn't improve in anything next year, that his draft stock moves.
Right. He's going to be in the exact same spot.
Right. And maybe it gives him a chance to, even if it's just 10 pounds, shed a couple pounds maybe and say, listen, can we put me into, first of all, I think it would help Purdue's offense. just to move him around a little bit more. But say, hey, put me in a position where I can show these NBA scouts every once in a while that I've worked on this, because I mean we see we saw the videos from the combine. Now I've also seen Ben Simmons look smooth from the 3-point line in the workout. So take from it what you will, but a guy who has that kind of touch and is not a tragedy at the free throw line, like that skill's probably there at least somewhere. And when you're 7'4", there's literally nobody who can guard you on the 3-point line, right? You just are going to get clear 3-point looks when you're 7'4". That's just kind of how it works. And there's a potential for that to happen, but even if not, he'll score 23 and 13 and still be the most dominant force in the sport next year. And someone will guarantee that they draft him with a second round pick again. I'm completely on board.
Yeah.
I want to turn this around and talk about Oscar Tshiebwe for just a moment. Done with college, off to the NBA. And I think this is an interesting, right? Well, I'll ask you a question first. Is Oscar Tshiebwe's draft stock is better or worse, the same than it was 12 months ago?
Ooh. I'll say slightly better.
Okay.
I feel like he put his jump shot on display more this season.
Okay. Slight decreases in pretty much every statistical category at Kentucky this year, from last year to this year. And I just don't think it's productive next year for Oscar Tshiebwe to be on a team that has a bunch of freshmen that are trying to prove themselves at the NBA level as well. I think Purdue's entire existence is to shine Zach Edey in some way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And Kentucky's existence is to get everybody to the NBA. Fletcher Lawyer is not trying to go to the NBA next year.
And more specifically, Purdue's existence is to compete for a national championship and compete for Big Ten titles, which means exactly what you said, highlighting Zach Edey.
Right. Yes. Nobody's goal. I mean, you can tell anybody who commits to Kentucky can tell me that their goal is to win a national championship, and that doesn't have to not be your goal. But no one goes to Kentucky to win national championships. They just don't. They go to Kentucky because it is a proven track to the NBA, and Calipari has said just as much, right? Yeah. It is not my job. It is my job to get these guys to the NBA, not to win college basketball games. And as a result, I just think that Tshiebwe would be lost in the shuffle even more than I kind of felt like he was this year, because his moment of dominance in college basketball came and went, and he didn't go to the draft after. I just don't think if he had come back to Kentucky or gone anywhere, that what he was to the sport 2 years ago will return. I think Zach Edey can be exactly what he was to the sport last year.
Yes.
In 2023-24. And I'm not sure Tshiebwe would ever return to that apex mountain of his college career that was a couple years ago. So you might as well just... It's kind of the other side of the coin to the same conversation about, I'm not sure it's going to get any better. I guess it could get a little worse, but ultimately, I'm not sure it's worth the 12 more months in college, and you might as well just go at a point where you're going to get drafted somewhere.
Let me take it one step further.
Sure.
So Chris Livingston also declared Antonio Reeves is coming back to college somewhere. TBD where.
Yeah.
Is this the best case scenario for Kentucky, losing all three guys?
From a what perspective?
From a success next season perspective.
Absolutely not.
Interesting. Okay.
No. five freshmen in your starting lineup don't win college basketball games at a high level anymore.
And that's really what I was getting at. To me, this is fascinating because
yes, but this is not how you are a successful college basketball team,
right? Because you have two different things. Can you be? Because the other part of that is, can you be successful building a team around Oscar Tshiebwe again? And you were adamant the answer is no.
No.
So,
but is a basketball team, would I bet on a basketball team with Oscar Tshiebwe at the center of it being better than the Kentucky team that they now have? 100%.
Fair.
100%.
Okay. That's what I was getting at, as you were somebody who was on this from the beginning of last season saying this doesn't work. Now they're going the complete opposite direction of, 100% modern, all the freshmen, the one and dones, which also has not led to success. So does that change if Antonio Reeves comes back?
I don't think Antonio Reeves is coming back to Lexington.
Yeah, I don't think so either. It's just I guess my ultimate point here is
because Antonio Reeves also gets lost in the shuffle.
Right. Exactly. Right. 100%.
And because Calipari doesn't want, if you ask Calipari, hey, would you rather you have two of your freshmen be awesome on the wing or Antonio Reeves be awesome on the wing? He's going to say the freshman because that's the point of his job, and that's what people in Lexington will get excited about.
Mm-hmm.
The novelty of Antonio Reeves, if it ever existed, has come and gone. It's way more fun if DJ Wagner is awesome, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's part of the point I try to get out with Tshiebwe too, is that it's just being an old big at Kentucky does nothing for you. It just doesn't. Yeah. Especially this year with this recruiting class.
Right. And so you can look at this and go, Kentucky took a massive L here, right? Potentially losing all three guys, at least losing two of them, including Tshiebwe.
Mm-hmm.
I can also flip it and say, am I going to sit here and say that's a national title contender next season? No, not until I see it. And then maybe I'll have to start thinking about the possibility they can win with all those freshmen. Because I'm right there with you. That formula is not one I buy.
I would not for a single second next year call Kentucky a national title contender. And you can call me out if I do. They're not.
Okay.
They're not. It doesn't matter how good they are.
And so it's not like you're trading in these guys who you lost or potentially lose in Reeves for something that you feel really good about in terms of winning a national championship.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I don't feel like you're losing all that much in terms of what you would have had with them. It's a very interesting dynamic to me. That's really just all I wanted to discuss.
No, I think you're right. And I also just success is like Kentucky fans are welcome to act like to get all up in arms when Kentucky isn't as good as they quote unquote should be. But it's been a long time since the point of Kentucky was to be as good of a college basketball team as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the epitome of it. And you see all the guys that could, Arthur Kaluma, the only interesting possible addition to the roster is Arthur Kaluma withdrew his name from the draft. Yep. And it was reported that Kentucky was one of the teams that had reached out to him.
I love that.
That would be interesting. But
I'm a big Arthur Kaluma guy.
I'm a big Arthur Kaluma guy too. That's why he shouldn't go to Kentucky.
I'd say if I'm him, I'm not going to Kentucky. Right. Yeah.
But it would be because this is the first team since. I guess one of those Duke teams, the 2018-19 Duke team, that's going to be as dependent on freshman performance as this one's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see how it goes, especially in a sport that, went from the best players in the sport leave as soon as they can. We're kind of turning the other way.
Oh, well, we've done a complete 180. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So having the talent be head and shoulders above the rest is not as big of a, in terms of your freshman class,
Right.
is not as big
Right.
of a needle mover as it once was.
Nope.
That'll be interesting. Let's talk about another team that. Let's talk about your Final Four teams. Let's go. Let's talk about UConn, and let's talk about, and then I'll give you the microphone, and you can tell me that you told me so when it comes to the Owls of FAU. But UConn, Tristan Newton on his way back. That was an unsurprising decision that we heard officially. I think it was 2 days ago now.
I think he was one of the first ones yesterday, if I remember correctly.
Gotcha. Okay.
It all blurs together. There were so many.
But the big news, right? It felt like Adama Sanogo was on his way to the NBA draft, and that did play out in that manner. The big one for UConn, and perhaps the guy that was, at the top of the list for the most important UConn Husky next year, was Andre Jackson. He stays in the draft as well. And then now all of a sudden, a UConn team that right out of the gates of the Final Four felt like a team that was going to be right there again next year. At the very least, Josh, we have some unproven holes in that UConn roster, and Dan Hurley's attempt at repeating and being the first team to repeat since Florida back in the 2000s, a much sketchier proposition at this point.
Yep. We talked about this a little bit when we did our preseason top 10. I have questions. To me, Andre Jackson doesn't get the credit he deserves. The story of how they figured this out again was realizing how to use him effectively and how to maximize what he did well while hiding the thing he doesn't do well, which is shoot the basketball. But everything else he's so good at. It's a massive loss. It's a bigger loss than Sanogo. Clingan is going to be just fine. And so getting Tristan Newton back helps. And they're another one of those teams now that they know they've lost these guys. Transfer portal round 3. Maybe they make a big splash here. And then we'll have a little bit different conversation. But yeah, I honestly, I would rather have Jackson than Sanogo. If I'm
100%.
Yeah. If I'm Hurley. That's not because I think Jackson's a better player. That's because I know I have Donovan Clingan.
Mm-hmm. And because Jackson is a harder, like, it's not just that they already have the replacement on the roster. It's just he's just harder to replace.
Yes, that too. Mm-hmm.
It is way harder to find a guy that Andre Jackson's the type of guy that you lose him and you need 2 guys on your roster to replace the things that he does.
Yes.
Which is just, that's just math. That's just math, right?
But
absolutely, this was one of the bigger decisions in terms of the ceiling of a team that didn't necessarily involve the very best player that was making a decision on that team. Because, Adama Sanogo was a better college basketball player than Andre Jackson last year and would have been a better college basketball player this year than Andre Jackson. But it is undeniable the stick everything together nature of Jackson. And to your point, something that you've harped on throughout the tournament was when you figure out how to use a guy like that, it is a massive headache for the other team.
That's all I got there.
UConn top 10 team next year. Yay or nay?
No.
UConn top 15. Yay or nay?
Yes.
Okay. I still think that's a team that with tons of talent, recruiting class coming in, that they're going to be fine. Oh, yeah. But I highly doubt that the conversation next year heading into the season about the those 6 teams that really have a chance to that start the season as national title contenders. I don't foresee at this point that UConn will be a part of that inner circle.
No,
not far away. You'll be able to see them in the peripherals of that view, but not quite in that inner circle that some of these other teams are going to.
It is. This is not a look at what they're bringing back from a national, a Final Four team, a national championship team. They might have actually really just been the best team in the country last season, and they're all coming. This is a completely different team.
Speaking of, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we're gonna have to see what this looks like before you just assume that they can turn into what they were last season.
Agreed. Speaking of teams that were in the Final Four that are going to look very, very similar to the team that you saw in the 2023 Final Four. Josh, on this podcast not all that long ago, I thought that there was no way that Dusty May in the current landscape of college basketball was going to get the overwhelming majority of his team back, and that we were going to get basically the same FAU that we got in the Final Four. I still stand next to all of the things I said when we had this conversation about how FAU's season is looked at completely differently if they lose but to Memphis, and I will still stand by all of those things that I said about it not being a foregone conclusion that they're a top 15 team in the sport. But with that being said, Elijah Martin, John L. Davis, both headed back to the Owls. Dusty May kept that group together, and the foundation is there for them to be a top 10 team next year.
Yeah. I'm even hesitant to jump to the top 5 thing. There seem to be a lot of people that have just put them down to the top 5 team. I'm not quite there yet.
Yeah, I don't need to reiterate everything I've already said on this podcast about that.
We've had that conversation.
If you didn't think FAU was a top 15 team, was a top 10 team on Selection Sunday last year, then we need to pump the brakes on them being a top 5 team with the same group.
Yeah,
just saying.
I generally agree with that sentiment.
But it is super cool that FAU went to the Final Four and FAU found a way to keep the same group together with the way that the sport works right now. That, for me, is the headline and a win for mid-majors and just any team that isn't, in the blue blood conversation right now. It's a massive win.
And think about it, right? They lost every player that could have returned. Mm-hmm. That means they lost nobody to the transfer portal.
Yep.
And of the rare teams that don't lose anybody to the transfer portal, they are a team in which other programs were actively recruiting their players to enter the transfer portal.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just there will be interest. It was, I want you to come.
Right.
Specifically John L. Davis and Elijah Martin.
Mm-hmm.
Because they went through the draft process because they are professional basketball players. Whether they're NBA, we're going to have to see. Which is also why, to me, it was smart and Dusty May has talked about this idea of, look, if you basically telling these guys, look, if you come back, we're going to find ways to get you your money. Will it be as much as you get at other schools? Maybe not. But he is doing everything he can to do right by these players and say, you deserve your money. We're going to do what we can to make, and obviously he's bought an incredible amount of goodwill and loyalty that everybody trusts him and go, okay, we really enjoy playing with each other. We trust you. We trust this program. We're just going to do this again.
Yep.
And they should absolutely be thinking they have a chance to win a national championship. Whether they do or not is a different conversation.
Sure.
But from those two guys in particular, if they go do this again, let's say they go win the AAC or go, toe-to-toe with Houston, make another deep NCAA tournament run, where it's very clear they are just two of the best players in the country. Their draft stock, having gone from nobody knew who they were, even though Florida Atlantic had a really good season even before the NCAA tournament, to everybody's eyes are on them. If they have phenomenal seasons, this is going to do wonders. Mm-hmm. Maybe it doesn't lead to a long NBA career, But you got to think at least they're getting, summer league invites. Maybe one of them gets drafted. All kinds of opportunities overseas. That there is absolutely reason for them to come back and try and build. And that's, to me, what's different about, at the end of the day, what's different about this FAU team than most Cinderellas. There is 100% from not just a program standpoint, but an individual standpoint, reason for these guys to come back and try and do this again and see if they can take it even further. It's in their best interest as well. Mm-hmm. Because we're having a different conversation about come this time next year if we're talking about another deep run in a AAC regular season title for Florida Atlantic.
It's interesting because they kind of fit into specifically Elijah Martin and John L. Davis. A lot of what happens in the transfer portal with players of their caliber is, okay, get me to a place where I can show the NBA that I can play in the NBA. Mm-hmm. And the cool thing is that they can put themselves in that position at FAU next year.
Correct.
And whether it's because Dusty May has convinced them of that or they always believed it, that was the biggest reason why I just would not have bet on all of them coming back. Because it sounds really good right after you go to the Final Four to be like, yeah, we're going to run it back. This is awesome. But then when John Calipari comes calling, or Texas comes calling, or Mark Few comes calling, or John Shire comes calling, and you're going to play 30 games on national TV next year, and you've already tested the waters because the NBA at least has you on their radar, then it becomes a lot harder. Mm-hmm. And even if getting to do everything that you want to do at Florida Atlantic and undoubtedly having more responsibility as a player at Florida Atlantic and all of those things, it can be really hard to convince yourself that is still the best way for you to get to the NBA. When you could staple Duke to the front of your chest. And I don't even know off the top of my head I don't even think we got to the point where there were any real reports about any team, about which teams were going after those guys. I'm sure there were names just that were absolutely that big going after those guys.
They didn't let it get to that point though.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that is cool that whatever is going on at FAU and what Dusty May has done at FAU was able to withstand that. And to withstand the big names and the draft and to get all of those guys back is very cool. And it might just be the best way for them to all take its next step forward in terms of the next step in their college, in their professional basketball careers.
Yeah. And it's interesting to just think about the role that moving conferences played in this. Mm-hmm. Because all of a sudden, no, it's not prime time Duke, where your games are on at least the ACC network every single game. Mm-hmm. But Houston got on national television plenty of times last season. Was it more ESPN 2s? Sure. Mm-hmm. Right? But they're coming in as a team people are going to want to pay attention to in a conference that is much better than the one they're currently playing in. There are some added levels of intrigue where it's not just, can we do this again? But there are interesting challenges ahead of this team to back up what they did last season, because you've been one of those people pointing out, and I'm also kind of this mindset generally, that I only want to give so much credit to a team for rolling through a conference when they're just better than everybody else. Because there are a lot of average high major teams that can do that too. Mm-hmm. So let's see what they can do when they've got Houston on the schedule, when they got Memphis on the schedule, and when everybody is coming after them because they just made it to a Final Four. Oh, that's true. Why do I keep – thank you. I've said that about 3 times at this point.
There's all kinds of – but they're kind of in a similar spot to Houston in terms of an AAC team that is the preconceived notions of them heading into the year is that that's a really high level basketball team.
Right. They are kind of coming in immediately and replacing Houston. Yeah.
Yes. From a not from a pedigree perspective, of course, but from the role that they play in that conference next year. But shouts to Dusty Mace, shouts to FAU. It is cool more than anything else. And I will maintain my pumping the brakes on just waiting to see how good they are next year. But it is cool. It is cool, and there's no doubt about that. Okay, let's get to a couple Big Ten teams here. You had Michigan State. I had Michigan State in our top 10 preseason college basketball. Way too early college basketball top 10 a couple weeks ago. And the deadline was very, very nice to them. AJ Hoggard, Jay Atkins, they are on their way back. That's all kinds of production. Trivia time. How many assists did AJ Hoggard?
6 point something?
5.9. Yeah. That's a lot. That's a lot of assists in college basketball. Mm-hmm. Anyways. But Izzo's squad is ripe with talent for the 2023-24 season, and what happened at the declaration deadline has cemented Michigan State's place in preseason as one of the best teams in the sport.
This is another good example of this is exactly what should have happened in terms of being in the best interest of these two guys. In years past, though, you just never would have been sure. Because neither of them are NBA players at this point. So go through the process, get your evaluation, get your NIL money, come back, and then try and address the things and showcase the things that NBA teams want to see from you. And so I was incredibly confident both of them were coming back. We both operated under the assumption they were both coming back because just like Edey,
it didn't make any sense level of say.
Right. And it's not that the money's going to draw them away because they just can't turn it down because this is Michigan State. Michigan State will get them plenty of money.
Yeah.
So this is another good, I mean, we talked at depth about what this team will be, and we'll talk about it more when we get into season previews. That was all of this. I just didn't really even think twice about it. I saw, okay, yep, Akins is back, Hoggard's back, exactly what I expected. We move on to the more interesting conversations, namely Edey, because this was what I always expected to happen because it's the logical choice.
Yeah. I just wanted to bring it up. The cementing of Michigan State as probably the Big Ten favorites. That's an interesting conversation. Zach Edey coming back is very helpful. Very, very helpful. I expect both of those teams to be in the same realm in terms of betting odds when it comes to who's the favorite, and when it comes to preseason media polls, I'm sure they will be very tight, and there will be programs. There will be members of the media who go one way or the other, but that was confirmed yesterday, as was, and perhaps a little bit more surprising, if not surprising, just a team that absolutely has thrown their name into the hat as one of the better Big Ten teams next year, and that is Illinois, that got back both Terrence Shannon Jr. and Coleman Hawkins. Brad Underwood gets his two most important players back with some, right, he's been active in the portal. There have been some nice additions there. And the Illinois train that started kind of with Kofi Coburn and Ayodesumu, in one way or another has continued to roll on since those guys left. And it looks like that in Champaign, it will continue to roll at least through the next season.
This was the one that was much dicier. Mm-hmm. It really felt like this could go either way for both of them. Because Terrence Shannon's been around for a while. There does come a point where I just understand I'm kind of done with college. And Coleman Hawkins, you and I are both big on this idea that that dude is going to be a contributor in the NBA. He does all of those things that just scream, Grant, not necessarily the exact same game, but Grant Williams, right? Of just guy who contributes to good NBA teams.
Yeah. If you told me at the beginning of last year that Coleman Hawkins was not going to average 10 points a game. Like, that might be the most disappointing.
You were talking about him as Big Ten Player of the Year.
Well,
do you remember that?
Let's talk about how he started.
Yeah. Oh no. I'm not saying you were. I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm just saying that to add to your point, because I didn't think you were crazy. Do you remember you didn't say he was going to win it, but you said something about I think he's going to be in the conversation or something like that.
Yes, I do remember that. And it just kind of didn't happen that way. But he's absolutely a guy who is immediately on my radar for a guy at the tippity top of the Big Ten in terms of all conference teams.
So this is another one where
23 and 12 on 8 of 14 shooting and was 5 of 8 from the 3-point line against Eastern Illinois to start the year. It's a pretty good stat line.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
Of course.
And then it took him 4 games after that to get to 8 field goals.
Yeah.
He had 10 total in the following 4 games. Tough.
Yeah. Obviously, you're a much better basketball team than you were 24 hours ago.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, similar to the Kentucky conversation, this team underachieved last season.
Mm-hmm.
Coleman Hawkins, you didn't get the jump you expected from him. Terrence Shannon was fine, but not exactly what you were hoping for as one of the highest profile transfers in the country.
He's very Kevin McCullough-ish from the sense that Terrence Shannon Jr. Okay. The things that he does, I just think are elevated on a really good team than him pulling a mediocre team.
Mm-hmm.
Illinois was better than that last year, but an above average team into one of the more upper echelons of the sport.
Yeah. So one more time to dive into this, but that was one of the things I was thinking about with this one is huge to get them both back.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you got to figure out how to do something different here because last season didn't work.
Yeah. Okay, those are the big things that I had on my list. I have a list of other notable returning guys or notable staying in the NBA draft guys that I can offer to you, and you can stop me when you want to, or we can go to you, and if there are any big things that you want to make sure we spend some time on, then you can take the wheel.
I want to throw one thing out there before we get to your list.
Okay.
Biggest winners of yesterday outside of Purdue and generally the NBA draft process, I would argue Creighton.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Creighton lost Kaluma and Nembhard to the portal, obviously. That's not part of this conversation. Mm-hmm. But you get Kalkbrenner and Trey Alexander back.
Yep.
You get Baylor Shireman back.
Yep.
You add Stephen Ashworth.
Yep.
And Marquette did not get everybody back because Olivia Maxine Prosper was the guy who went into the combine and kind of blew up a little bit. And all of a sudden, at that point, you're staying in the draft.
Yeah.
And we talked about UConn. All of a sudden, I went from feeling not so great about Creighton to feeling like Creighton might be able to hang with those two teams.
And if it weren't for Villanova, you'd feel even better because Villanova might have won the offseason.
Yes, Villanova has reloaded in a very big way
for other reasons, right?
Yes.
For transfer reasons, and now the list of transfers coming to Villanova is really, really special.
So you're looking at those 4 teams. Maybe Xavier gets themselves into that conversation, but as kind of the 3 teams last season that were going back and battling back and forth, and ultimately Marquette came out on top. And I guess Providence was in there for a while too. But not only did you get your 2 guys back, but the other 2 teams also lost some pieces. And so now I feel like I still give me Marquette as the best team. I'm not going to waver from that. Mm-hmm. But all of a sudden, I feel like those 3 teams, and you throw Villanova in there, are on much more equal footing than I maybe had expected a month ago.
Yeah, I agree with you. Trey Alexander was on my list of other notables to return. He will return to Creighton. And right, I kind of thought, if you asked me the day after the national championship, what you felt like the hierarchy of the Big East was going to be, right? It'd be, at that point, it was, okay, Marquette and UConn are probably at the tippity top of that conversation, and there are some other teams kind of lingering, and it feels much more, I mean, Villanova might be the team that replaces UConn in that conversation with Marquette, but there was no team that was really far ahead already that their offseason was completely ideal.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, right, well, Villanova's was completely ideal, but that's a team that missed the tournament, right? So they were jumping into the conversation. UConn's offseason so far probably hasn't gone the way that they were hoping it would, at least from, if for no other reason other than Andre Jackson. And Marquette doesn't get everybody back. And Creighton has a really strong, both in the draft process, but also getting a guy like Stephen Ashworth is an impactful thing.
Lost two starters
sticking
though.
Around. True, but this kind of hodgepodge in the Big East of the only team that has had a truly picture perfect offseason thus far is Villanova, and that was not a team that was in the conversation at the end of last year. So I think all of that to say, I think it's setting up to be a really fun Big East year, and to the point where as long as those teams kind of live up to the expectations at this point, that it's going to feel like every single night you've got a Big East game that means a ton, and that is between two really high quality college basketball teams.
When Kaluma entered the portal, because we were having this conversation with our top 10, I felt like Creighton had a lot of ground to make up. And I feel like Creighton has basically made that ground up. Maybe not all the way there, but awfully close.
Kaluma's an interesting one. It would be really fun if he would go back to Creighton, but it is what it is.
Does not sound like that's happening.
Does not sound like that is happening. A couple notables. I've actually only got one guy. This is interesting. We talked briefly about the Tennessee guys, but it felt like all of the other notables yesterday, a lot of them were, hey, that guy is coming back to school rather than that guy is leaving. One of the guys that did stay, UCLA's Jalen Clark, will stay in the draft. So no Jalen Clark for Mick Cronin next year. And then I got a list here starting with Jamal Shed on his way back to Houston. That's a big one for a team making the jump to the Big 12. Speaking of the Big 12, Naquan Tomlin headed back to school.
Big
W for Jerome Tang and the Kansas State program. Of course, plenty of high of notable decisions kind of around that Kansas State program, and Naquan Tomlin coming back is a good one for them. We talked about Trey Alexander returning to Creighton. All aboard the Must Bus is Devo Davis, at least for one more year, and that's a program that's kind of made their living on restocking every year the last few years and having a team that looks completely different. That's certainly not going to be the case this year, but having a guy like Devo Davis come back is not an unimportant development. And then in the Pacific Northwest in Spokane, Gonzaga is going to get Anton Watson back, which is not an unimportant development either.
Yeah.
That's my list.
All of a sudden, Gonzaga looks pretty good. Something you weren't sure about at the beginning of this whole thing. Right.
They figured it out. That they figured it out. Shocking.
Somehow, some way. And so even though you lose Malachi Smith, they will be just fine. On the Arkansas part of this, getting Devo Davis back, huge. You do lose Jordan Walsh. You miss out on Ron Holland, who's going to go play in the G League for the Ignite. My stance was always, Muss is going to get one of them. Maybe not all three, maybe not two. He's going to find a way to fill that roster spot with somebody who is going to contribute, and he did that with Devo Davis.
Yep.
Also, want to recognize Adam Flagler's career has come to a close as a personal favorite on this podcast, and especially of yours.
Shouts to Adam Flagler.
Which is probably going to then lead to Ray J. Dennis going to Baylor. I believe he's committing in an hour.
Yep.
And the other team I wanted to mention real quickly as kind of a combination of things that have happened that I think is flying under the radar is TCU. Damian Boss stays in the draft, which is a significant loss. You have replacing to do in the backcourt. However, you get Emmanuel Miller back. Those were your two NBA draft guys you weren't sure about.
Yep.
And also just got Ernest Uday. Overall, considering the circumstances, not a bad end to the offseason for the Horned Frogs.
Yeah, we'll take it. We'll take it. I'm out of teams and players to discuss. You got anything else?
I don't think so. Well, obviously have more time to reevaluate all this once the portal finally stops churning.
I think it's set to, in like 3 years from now, the 2023 portal will come to a close. Be like, yep, that final guy finally made a decision. And it's, April of 2026.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that aspect of it, but now because now you've got the trifecta of declaring for the draft, maintaining your eligibility, and entering the transfer portal. At which point those players are, and you've got your Olivier Kamois and your Arthur Kalumas who are in that group that now they're going to make their decision.
Yeah.
So that process hadn't actually started until they decided that they were coming back to college. And so Antonio Reeves would also be in that group. Yeah.
Right.
You had the original portal guys, you had the second group of portal guys, and now we're on to portal group 3.
Right. It's the guys who were going to go portaling no matter what.
Right.
Then it was the guys who made decisions on going portaling based on the first group's decision to go portaling and where those guys ended up. And then you have this third group of guys that was going to go portaling, assuming that they stayed in college basketball, but wanted to go through the NBA draft process. And now those guys need a place to play college hoops. So there will be plenty of developments over the next couple weeks.
Oh, yes.
Next 4 podcasts? 4? I think that's right.
3?
After this one? I think 3 leading up to the draft and then
2 leading up to the draft.
2 leading up to the draft? Is there only 2? Man, I'm going to look at the calendar. Here we go. That's correct. 2 leading up to the draft and then a third right after the draft. We're going to turn our attentions to the NBA draft. Typically a Monday pod during the college basketball offseason. We're going to switch to Thursday for the next couple of weeks. We switched to Thursday today because yesterday was the draft declaration deadline. Thank you very much. And we're going to stay here on Thursday so that on the 23rd, June 23rd, the Friday right after the NBA draft, we can have a podcast about that. And then after that, we're going to take a 10-day hiatus and then come back on Monday, July 3rd. And then from that point on, we're back to Mondays. So for the next couple of weeks, Thursdays, Friday, right after the NBA draft. The NBA draft is June 22nd. And then we'll get back to regularly scheduled programming. Anything else you got, Josh, that we need to discuss before we get out of here?
No.
Cool. Please subscribe to the Jays for Days podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at Jays for Days Pod, YouTube, Shorts, TikTok, channel, all of that fun stuff. And we'll be back. We'll be back in a week, okay? Next Thursday. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. And we will see you later.